I am Henry Caldwell. 71 years old, and for 40 years I was the man corporations called when they needed to find missing millions. I was a forensic accountant, a ghost in the financial machine. But to my family, I was just a boring, retired old man who pinched pennies. My ex-wife Patricia left me for a flashy real estate developer named Richard because she wanted excitement. My son Brandon told me Richard was the father figure he always wanted because Richard knew how to spend money while I only knew how to save it. They stripped me of my house, my savings, and my dignity. They thought I was on a one-way flight to obscurity. They were wrong. I was on a business trip to buy their debts. Before I tell you how I legally foreclosed on my ex-wife's wedding in front of 200 guests, tell me which city you are listening from in the comments. Hit like if you believe that silence is not weakness, it is preparation. The sound of the judge's gavel hitting the woodblock was the only thing that cut through the humidity of that Chicago courtroom. It was a sharp final sound, the sound of a life being severed in two. I sat there in my charcoal suit, the one I had worn to my retirement party 3 years ago, and watched the woman I had been married to for 35 years refuse to look at me. Patricia was busy whispering something to her lawyer, a man named Sullivan, who had a smile that looked like it had been sharpened with a whetstone. Mr. Caldwell, the judge, said, looking over his spectacles at me, based on the forensic audit of marital assets and the prenuptial agreement being voided due to the technicality regarding the filing date, the court awards 60% of the liquid savings to the petitioner, Patricia Caldwell. Furthermore, the primary residence at 142 Oakwood Drive is awarded to the petitioner. I did not flinch. I did not stand up and scream about the injustice. I did not beg. I simply did the math. I have always done the math. It is a reflex. I looked at Patricia. She was wearing a new Chanel suit. I knew the retail price was around $4,000. I knew she had leased a new Mercedes last week. I knew the maintenance costs of the Oakwood house were roughly $18,000 a year in property taxes alone, plus utilities and landscaping. Patricia turned to me then. Her eyes were bright with victory. She leaned over the mahogany table separating us. Her perfume was overpowering, a floral scent that she had started wearing only after she met Richard. "Henry," she whispered loud enough for her lawyer to hear. "You are a good man, but you are just too small for the life I want to live. You count coupons. Richard builds skylines. I need to breathe." I nodded slowly. I picked up my pen, a simple Parker ballpoint that I had used to sign audit reports that sent corrupt CEOs to federal prison, and I signed the divorce decree. I pushed the papers across the table. "Enjoy the house, Patricia," I said, my voice steady. "The roof is due for replacement in 2 years. Make sure you check the flashing around the chimney." She laughed, a short, sharp sound. "Oh, Henry, do you really think Richard is going to worry about roof repairs? He is going to tear that old thing down and build a modern masterpiece. You just do not get it. You never did." I watched them leave the courtroom. Patricia was practically skipping. Her lawyer shook her hand and handed her a bill that I calculated was roughly $30,000 for his services. She paid it without blinking, using the funds from the joint account that had just been frozen and transferred to her. I sat on the bench outside the courtroom for a moment. I took out my small leather notebook. I wrote down the date and the amount I had just lost. $700,000 in savings. A house valued at $900,000. 40 years of hard work gone in 20 minutes. But as I sat there, I was not thinking about the past. I was looking at the burn rate. I knew Patricia's spending habits better than she knew herself. With the settlement she just received, and her lack of income combined with the lifestyle she was trying to project, she had liquidity for exactly 18 months. If she accelerated her spending to keep up with Richard Blake, that timeline would shrink to 12 months. I stood up and buttoned my jacket. The air in the hallway was cold, but I felt a strange warmth in my chest. It was the feeling of a clean slate. They thought they had stripped me bare, but they had only removed the anchors that were holding me back. 2 days later, I met my son Brandon for lunch. He chose the venue, of course. It was a steakhouse downtown, the kind of place with dark wood paneling and waiters who wore tuxedos. The kind of place where a salad cost $25. Brandon was 32 years old. He was a good-looking boy, but he had a softness to him that worried me. He had never known a day of want in his life. I had paid for his college, his car, his first apartment. I had tried to teach him the value of compound interest and the danger of leverage, but his eyes would always glaze over. He was already seated when I arrived, nursing a scotch. It was 2 in the afternoon. "Hey, Dad," he said, not standing up to greet me. "Thanks for coming." I sat down. I ordered an iced tea. Brandon ordered the Wagyu ribeye. "So, Brandon," I said, unfolding my napkin, "how is the job at the agency?" He waved his hand dismissively. "It is fine. Actually, I am thinking of quitting. Richard says I am wasting my potential working for a salary. He says real wealth is made through equity and real estate." I felt a tightening in my jaw. Richard says. I had been hearing that name in every conversation for the past 6 months. "Richard has a point," I said carefully. "But you need capital to invest, Brandon. You need a safety net." Brandon laughed. He took a sip of his scotch. "That is your old school thinking, Dad. That is why you and Mom grew apart. You operate from a place of fear. Richard operates from a place of abundance. He calls it OPM. Other people's money. That is how the big dogs play." I looked at my son. He was wearing a watch that I knew he could not afford. A Rolex Submariner. "Nice watch," I said. "Richard gave it to me," Brandon said, beaming. "It was an early wedding gift. He is going to be the best man at my wedding next month, Dad. I wanted to tell you in person." The waiter arrived with the steak. The smell of seared meat filled the air between us. I stared at the iced tea in my glass, watching the condensation roll down the side. "I see," I said. "You are replacing me as your best man." Brandon cut into his steak. He did not look at me. "Look, Dad. It is not personal. It is just optics. The wedding is going to be huge. Richard is paying for everything. The venue is this incredible estate in the Hamptons. Senators are going to be there. Investors. It is a networking event as much as a wedding. Richard thinks it would look better if he stood up there with me. He is just more impressive, Dad. You know how you get around crowds. You stand in the corner and check your watch." I took a sip of tea. The liquid was bitter. "So I am invited as a guest," then I asked. "Of course," Brandon said, chewing. "But maybe do not wear that suit you are wearing now. Richard said he could set you up with his tailor. Get you something Italian. Something that does not look like you bought it at a department store." I looked at the suit I was wearing. It was a Brooks Brothers. Classic. Durable. Paid for in cash. "I will keep that in mind," I said. "And the house, Brandon, the one you were looking at in the suburbs." "Oh, that is the best news," Brandon said, putting down his knife. "The bank was giving me a hard time because of my debt-to-income ratio. But Richard stepped in. He is co-signing the loan. Actually, he is putting the down payment down through one of his development companies. We close next week." I froze. My forensic instincts kicked in instantly. A development company putting down a down payment for a personal residence, that was tax fraud. That was commingling of funds. That was a red flag the size of a billboard. "Brandon," I said, leaning forward, "listen to me carefully. Do not sign anything that Richard puts in front of you without a lawyer looking at it. If his company is paying for your house, the title is not in your name. You are just a tenant." Brandon slammed his fork down. "God. Dad. Why do you always have to do this? Why do you have to poke holes in everything? You are jealous. That is what it is. You are jealous that another man is stepping up to do what you never could. You gave me savings bonds for my birthday. Richard gave me a Rolex. He is giving me a house. Just be happy for me for once. He signaled the waiter for the check. I am not paying for this, Brandon said loudly. Put it on the Blake Developments corporate card. He pulled out a black credit card and slapped it on the tray. He looked at me with a defiance that broke my heart. I am going to the bathroom, I said quietly. I walked to the front of the restaurant. I found the maitre d'. The bill for table 4, I said, taking out my wallet. I will pay it. Cash. But sir, the young gentleman gave me a card. Run the card, I said. If it declines, come find me. I waited by the coat check. 3 minutes later, the waiter came back looking flushed. I am so sorry, sir, he whispered. The card, it came back, declined. Code 05. Do not honor. I handed him $300 in cash. Keep the change, I said, and tell my son the system was down. Do not embarrass him. I walked out of the restaurant without saying goodbye. I stood on the sidewalk and watched through the window as Brandon laughed at something on his phone, completely unaware that his father had just saved him from humiliation and that the plastic card in his pocket was nothing more than a piece of scrap debt. A week later, I was at JFK Airport Terminal 4. I had 2 suitcases. That was it. Everything else I had either sold or donated. I was moving to Tuscany. I had bought a small vineyard there 10 years ago through a shell company. Patricia never knew about it because she never looked at the tax returns she just signed where I pointed. She thought we vacationed in Florida because we could not afford Europe. I took us to Florida because I wanted to keep Europe for myself. I was standing at the curb waiting to check my bags when a pearl-white Bentley pulled up. The window rolled down. It was Richard. Patricia was in the passenger seat wearing oversized sunglasses, looking like a movie star from a silent film. Well, look who it is, Richard boomed. His voice was deep and smooth like expensive bourbon. Henry. Heading somewhere? I gripped the handle of my suitcase. Italy, I said. Italy. Richard laughed. Fantastic. A little eat, pray, love journey for the golden years, eh? Good for you. Patricia and I are just heading to the first-class lounge. We are off to Paris for the weekend to shop for the wedding. Patricia leaned across him. She lowered her sunglasses. Italy, she said. With what money, Henry? Did you cash out your 401k? Oh, please tell me you are not staying in hostels. I am staying with friends, I said. Richard opened the door and stepped out. He was a big man, tanned loud. He wore a linen suit that screamed money. He walked around the car and popped the trunk. The porter rushed over to help him with their Louis Vuitton luggage. Richard walked over to me. He put a heavy hand on my shoulder. Listen, Henry, he said, lowering his voice. No hard feelings about the wedding rite. Brandon is a good kid. He just needs a little push, a little ambition. I am going to mold him, make him a killer in the business world. You did a decent job raising him, but he is ready for the major leagues now. He patted my shoulder as if I were a child. You just go enjoy your pasta and wine, Richard said. Leave the heavy lifting to me. He turned back to the car. Patricia blew me a kiss. A pity kiss. Ciao, Henry, she called out. Send us a postcard. I watched the Bentley glide away toward the VIP drop-off. I watched the porter struggle with their bags. I watched the world they had built, a world of shiny surfaces and loud noises. I turned and walked into the terminal. I checked my bags. I went through security. I did not look back. I boarded the plane. Seat 1A. I had paid for it with the dividends from a stock portfolio I had started in 1982. Another asset hidden inside a trust that Patricia's lawyer had missed because he was too busy looking at the obvious real estate. As the plane climbed over the Atlantic leaving New York and my old life behind, I opened my laptop. It was a rugged, sturdy machine. Not pretty, but powerful. I connected to the satellite Wi-Fi. I logged into a secure server. I typed in my username and password. The screen went black for a second, then filled with lines of code and data streams. I was not just a retired accountant. I was a specialist in forensic asset tracing. I had spent decades hunting down money that people tried to hide. I opened a new file. I named it Project Vulture. I typed in a search query Richard Blake. Blake Developments. Blake Global Holdings. The data began to pour in. Tax liens. Unpaid vendor invoices. Leveraged loans. Shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands with zero assets. I saw the credit card decline. At the restaurant was not a glitch. It was a symptom. Richard was swimming in debt. He was robbing Peter to pay Paul. And now he had brought my son and my ex-wife into his house of cards. I pulled up the public records for the Oak Haven estate, the venue for the wedding, foreclosure proceedings initiated. Auction date set for next month. I looked at the screen. I looked at the glass of champagne the flight attendant had just placed on my tray. They thought I was running away. They thought I was the victim. I opened a secure email client. I composed a message to Sullivan, my lawyer. Not the one who handled the divorce, the one who handled my real business. Subject acquisition. Body Sullivan. Look into the debt structure of Blake Developments, specifically the mortgage on the Oak Haven estate and the personal guarantees signed by Richard Blake. I want to buy the paper, all of it. Use the Aurora Trust. Hostile takeover. I hit send. The screen blinked. Message sent. I took a sip of champagne. It was crisp, cold. My son wanted to learn about OPM. Other people's money. I was about to give him a masterclass. My ex-wife wanted a life that wasn't boring. I was about to make her life very interesting. I leaned back in the leather seat as the plane reached cruising altitude. Target acquired. While I was learning the rhythm of the seasons in the quiet hills of Tuscany, Patricia was drowning in the noise of Manhattan. I did not need a crystal ball to see what she was doing. I had something better. I had access to the digital footprint of the shell company Richard was using to fund their lifestyle. Every swipe of the card was a data point on my screen. It was like watching a train wreck in slow motion, but the passengers were drinking vintage champagne and celebrating the crash. Patricia had always wanted to be a woman who lunched. She wanted to be one of those ladies on the Upper East Side who spent their afternoons discussing galas and Pilates instructors while their drivers waited outside with the engine running. With Richard, she finally got her wish, or at least the illusion of it. They moved into a penthouse suite at the Pierre Hotel while Richard claimed his new townhouse was being renovated. It was a classic grifter move, transience masked as exclusivity. I sat on my porch with a glass of red wine and scrolled through the receipts. It was nauseating. $12,000 for handbags at Hermes. $4,000 for a pair of shoes that looked like they would break if you stepped on a pebble. $500 lunches at Le Bernardin. Patricia was not just spending money, she was devouring it. She was trying to fill the hole inside her, the void where her self-esteem used to be, with silk and leather and truffle oil. She posted everything on social media, photo after photo of her new life. Her smile was wide, too wide. It was the smile of someone who was trying to convince herself as much as her audience. Look at me, she seemed to be screaming. Look at how happy I am without Henry. Look at how colorful my world is now that I have shed the gray skin of my accountant husband. But the numbers told a different story. The numbers whispered the truth that Patricia was too blind to see. The credit utilization on Richard's accounts was hitting 90%. He was cycling debt, paying off one card with a cash advance from another. It was a financial house of cards held together by arrogance and the sheer audacity of his lies. The cracks began to show on a Tuesday afternoon. I remember the day clearly because it was raining in Italy, and the internet connection was slow, but the transaction alert came through loud and clear. They were at Harry Winston on Fifth Avenue. This was the holy grail for Patricia. She had dragged me past those windows for 30 years, pressing her face against the glass, sighing over diamonds that cost more than my first house. I always told her that jewelry was a bad investment, that stones did not pay dividends. She hated me for it. Now she was inside. I could imagine the scene perfectly. The hushed atmosphere, the thick carpets, the sales associate wearing white gloves bringing out a velvet tray. Richard would be sitting there, legs crossed, looking bored, acting as if dropping $50,000 was an inconvenience rather than a catastrophe. Patricia chose a sapphire necklace. I saw the pending charge hit the system. $45,000. It was obscene. It was reckless. It was exactly what Richard needed to keep her sedated. But then the notification changed. Status declined. I leaned forward in my chair. My heart rate did not speed up. It slowed down. This was it. The first tremor of the earthquake. In the store, the atmosphere must have shifted instantly. I know how these systems work. When a card declines at that level, it is not a quiet beep. It is a silent alarm. The smile on the sales associate's face would have frozen. The white gloves would have paused over the card machine. "I am sorry, sir," the clerk would have said, his voice dropping a decibel to avoid embarrassing the other clients. "The card has been declined. Perhaps you have another form of payment." For a woman like Patricia, that moment would have been worse than death. To be shamed in the temple of luxury. To have the illusion shattered in front of strangers. I could picture the blood draining from her face. She would look at Richard, her eyes wide with sudden panic. The doubt she had buried deep down under layers of denial would have surged to the surface. Is this real? Is he real? Or have I made a terrible mistake? But Richard Blake was a professional. He was a master of the pivot. I did not need to be there to know what he did. He would not have flinched. He would have laughed. A loud, confident laugh that filled the quiet room. Unbelievable, he would have said, shaking his head. I just got off the phone with the private client group at Amex. I told them I was going to spoil my beautiful fiancée today, and they must have put a security freeze on the account, because the spending is too high. They think my card has been stolen because no one loves a woman this much. He would have turned to Patricia, taking her cold hand in his. "Baby," he would have said, looking her in the eye with that practiced intensity. "The bank is trying to protect us from my own generosity. Isn't that hilarious?" Then he would have pulled out another card. A debit card linked to the account where he had just deposited the down payment money from a separate scam. "Try this one," he would have told the clerk. "And call the bank, tell them Richard Blake is just getting started." The second card went through. I saw the approval on my screen. The transaction cleared. Patricia breathed again. I knew she did. She pushed the doubt back down. She swallowed the lie because it tasted sweeter than the truth. She let him put that sapphire necklace around her neck, and she looked in the mirror and told herself that everything was fine, that this was just a glitch, that rich people have security freezes all the time. She did not know that the second card drained the last liquid cash Richard had. She did not know that he was now technically insolvent. She walked out onto Fifth Avenue with a blue stone around her neck that was heavier than a millstone, and she felt like a queen. I closed my laptop. The rain was stopping in Tuscany. The air smelled of wet earth and rosemary. I felt a strange mixture of pity and resolve. Patricia had chosen her path. She had chosen the flash over the substance. She had chosen the lie. And soon, very soon, I was going to be the one to tell her the truth. Not with words, but with the one thing Richard Blake could not fake: ownership. I poured the rest of my wine into the grass. I did not feel like celebrating. The game was rigged and I was the one controlling the dice, but watching them fall was not bringing me joy. It was just bringing me closer to the end. The necklace was the bait, and Patricia had swallowed the hook. Now all I had to do was reel them in. The locals in the village of Montepulciano called me Il Americano Silencioso, the silent American. They watched me arrive with my 2 suitcases, and they assumed I was just another pensioner coming to burn through his retirement savings on sunset views and overpriced pasta. They assumed I was renting the small stone cottage on the edge of the old Rossi estate. They were wrong. I had not rented the cottage. I had purchased the entire estate, 300 acres of neglected Sangiovese vines, and a farmhouse that had not seen a coat of paint since the 1950s. Patricia and my son believed I was living on a fixed income. They thought my world had shrunk to the size of a postage stamp. In reality, my world had expanded to the horizon. The Rossi vineyard was a disaster when I took over. The previous owners had been sentimental. They kept old, diseased vines because their grandfather had planted them. They sold their wine in bulk to local cooperatives for pennies on the euro. They were bleeding cash, and they did not know how to apply a tourniquet. I did. I did not know much about viticulture when I landed, but I knew everything about efficiency. I knew about asset management. I walked the rows of vines not with a poet's eye, but with an auditor's gaze. I saw waste. I saw mismanagement. I saw potential that was being choked by nostalgia. I hired a young agronomist from the University of Florence. His name was Marco. He was brilliant, but he had no funding. I gave him a budget and a mandate. I told him we were not going to make table wine anymore. We were going to make a super Tuscan that would rival Tignanello. We ripped out 40% of the vines. The locals thought I was crazy. They crossed themselves when they walked past the gate. They said I was destroying history. I told Marco that we were not destroying history. We were pruning the dead weight to let the future grow. It was the same principle I used to use when restructuring failing corporations. You have to cut the rot before you can save the body. My days became a study in discipline. In New York, my life had been governed by the opening and closing bells of the stock exchange. Here it was governed by the sun. I woke up at 4 a.m. I made espresso on a stove that was older than I was. I put on work boots, not wingtips. I walked the perimeter of my property while the mist was still clinging to the valley floor. I worked. I did not just supervise. I worked. I learned how to prune a vine so that the energy went into the fruit and not the leaf. I learned how to test the soil pH with my own hands. My skin, which had been pale from 40 years of fluorescent office lighting, turned the color of polished walnut. My hands became calloused. The softness of the American corporate life melted away, leaving something harder, something more durable underneath. By the 4th month, we had bottled our first small batch under the new label. I did not advertise. I did not put up a website. I simply sent 6 cases to 6 of my old clients. Men who ran hedge funds in London and banks in Zurich. Men who appreciated exclusivity above all else. I included a simple note. This is what I am doing now. The price is €200 a bottle. The supply is limited. They bought everything. Then they asked for more. The vineyard went from bleeding money to generating a profit margin of 60% within 6 months. I had turned a failing farm into a blue-chip asset, and nobody in America knew about it. To Patricia, I was still just Henry, the retiree who probably ate beans out of a can. But the days were only half of my life. The nights belonged to Richard Blake. When the sun went down and the crickets began their chorus in the olive groves, I would retreat to my study. I had installed a satellite internet connection that was faster than what I had in Chicago. I would open my laptop and the farmer would disappear. The forensic accountant would return. Sullivan, my lawyer, was doing excellent work on the ground in New York. Every Tuesday and Thursday, he sent me a secure packet of documents, bank statements, loan applications, internal memos from Blake Developments. I treated Richard Blake exactly like I treated the neglected vines outside my window. I looked for the disease. The files were a testament to human greed and stupidity. Richard was not just bad with money, he was criminally negligent. I sat there with my reading glasses perched on my nose, tracing the flow of funds. He had taken a construction loan for a project in Jersey City and used it to pay the lease on his Bentley and the rent on the Pierre Hotel suite. That was wire fraud. He had solicited investors for a luxury condo building in Miami that did not even have the proper permits yet. He had used those deposit funds to pay off the interest on previous loans. That was a Ponzi scheme. I built a spreadsheet, a master file that tracked every lie. I color-coded them. Red for immediate felonies, yellow for civil liabilities, orange for tax evasion. The screen looked like a Christmas tree of corruption. I found it fascinating how much energy Richard spent on maintaining the facade. If he had worked half as hard on actually building something as he did on faking it, he might have been a success. But men like Richard are allergic to work. They are allergic to the kind of discipline I practiced every morning at 4 a.m. They want the harvest without the planting. One night I found the smoking gun. It was a document buried deep in a mislabeled folder that Sullivan's private investigator had recovered from a trash server. It was a personal guarantee. Richard had signed a document putting up the Oak Haven estate as collateral for a high-risk bridge loan from a shadow lender in Brooklyn. The kicker was that Richard did not own the Oak Haven estate outright. He only owned a 20% equity stake. The rest was held by a silent partnership of dentists and retirees from Florida, whom he had swindled years ago. By pledging the entire property as collateral without their consent, he had committed a fraud so clear and so documented that it would take a jury about 5 minutes to convict him. I stared at the document. I could hear the wind rustling the cypress trees outside. I took a sip of my own wine. It was structured complex with a long finish. Just like my plan. I did not send the document to the FBI. Not yet. That would be too quick. That would be a mercy killing. I wanted Richard to walk down the aisle. I wanted him to stand in front of 200 people and think he had won. I wanted Patricia to taste the victory before I turned it into ash in her mouth. I saved the file. I backed it up to 3 different cloud servers. I closed the laptop. I went to the window and looked out at my vineyard. The moon was full, illuminating the rows of vines that stood like soldiers in the dark. I had saved this land. I had healed it. I had given it a future. And now I was going to use the profits from this land to bury the man who had tried to bury me. I went to bed and slept the deep, dreamless sleep of a man who knows exactly what is going to happen next. The chaotic variable of emotion was gone. There was only the math, and the math was on my side. It was late evening in Tuscany when the phone rang. The sun had already dipped behind the cypress hills, leaving the sky a bruised purple, and I was sitting on the stone terrace finishing a plate of figs and prosciutto. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and jasmine. It was the kind of silence that money cannot buy, the kind of peace I had spent 40 years in skyscrapers trying to earn. Then the screen of my phone lit up. It was a video call request. The name on the screen was Patricia. I stared at it for a moment. My thumb hovered over the decline button. I knew nothing good could come from answering. I knew it would be a performance, a curated glimpse into a life she thought I envied. But the forensic auditor in me, the man who had spent decades looking for the one detail that did not fit, pushed the green button. I needed to see the enemy. I needed to see the state of play. The connection crackled, and then her face filled the screen. She was holding the phone high, the angle carefully chosen to eliminate any wrinkles. The lighting was perfect, warm and golden. She was in a room with dark wood paneling and leather-bound books that I suspected had never been opened. "Henry," she squealed. Her voice was too loud for the quiet Italian night. "Look who finally learned how to use technology. We were betting you would be asleep. It is what, like 9 o'clock over there? That used to be your bedtime, wasn't it?" "It is 10, Patricia," I said calmly. "I was just finishing dinner." "Dinner," she laughed. "Probably some rustic stew, right? Well, you are going to want to sit down for this. We just got the proofs back from the printer." She flipped the camera. On the mahogany desk in front of her lay a piece of heavy cream-colored cardstock. It was thick, almost like a small book. The edges were gilded in real gold leaf. The calligraphy was raised embossed in a deep navy ink. It read, "The Wedding of Patricia Caldwell and Richard Blake." And then below that, the location. The Grand Oak Haven Estate, Long Island. Patricia flipped the camera back to her face. Her eyes were wide, manic with excitement. "Can you believe it, Henry?" she whispered as if sharing a state secret. "We got Oak Haven. Do you know how long the waiting list is? 3 years. But Richard made one phone call. One call, Henry, and they bumped a senator's daughter to get us this date. It is the most exclusive venue on the East Coast. The Great Gatsby was basically written about this place." I looked at the invitation. I did not see romance. I saw a line item. I knew the rental fee for Oak Haven was $200,000 for a Saturday evening. That did not include catering, flowers, or the orchestra. "It is very impressive, Patricia," I said. "Expensive." She rolled her eyes. "Oh, stop it. Stop being such an accountant. This is about love. Richard says you cannot put a price tag on a soulmate." Suddenly the camera shook. A heavy arm draped around Patricia's shoulders. Richard squeezed into the frame. He was wearing a silk smoking jacket that looked like something out of a bad movie from the 1950s. He was holding a glass of amber liquid, and his face was flushed. "Henry, old boy," he boomed. His voice distorted slightly over the connection. "Still kicking around in the mud over there in Italy. Patricia tells me you are growing grapes. That is cute. A nice little hobby. Keeps the hands busy." "It is a business, Richard," I said. "Business," he scoffed. He took a swig of his drink. "Real business is happening right here. We are closing on a deal next week that is going to change the skyline of Manhattan. And this wedding, it is going to be the coronation. We have invited everyone. The mayor, the governor. It is going to be the event of the decade." He leaned closer to the camera. His eyes were glassy. "I told Brandon he should invite you," Richard said, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "But honestly, Henry, maybe it is better if you stay in Europe. You would feel out of place. This crowd, they are sharks. They eat the weak. And look at you. You look tired. You look like a peasant." Patricia giggled. She tried to hide it behind her hand, but I saw it. She was enjoying this. She was enjoying seeing the man she had promised to love and cherish being reduced to a punchline by a man who treated money like a toy. I did not respond to the insult. I did not defend myself. Because my eyes were not on Richard's face. My eyes were locked on something in the background, over his left shoulder. They were in Richard's home office. Behind him was a chaotic desk piled high with papers. It was a mess, a sign of a disorganized mind. But amidst the clutter, one thing stood out. It was a bright red file folder. It was sitting on top of a stack of unopened mail. The flap was open just enough. The video quality was high definition thanks to Patricia's new phone. I squinted slightly, letting my eyes focus on the logo printed on the corner of that folder. It was a palm tree next to a shield, the logo of Cayman National Bank. But it was the red stamp across the front of the document peeking out that made my blood run cold and then hot with adrenaline. Final notice, overdue. And right below it, a case number and a reference code that started with LIQ, liquidation. My mind raced. A Cayman account meant offshore holding companies. A liquidation notice meant the assets in that offshore account were gone or frozen. Richard wasn't just broke in New York. He was broke globally. He was insolvent in tax havens that were designed to never let you go broke. "Henry, are you still there?" Patricia asked, waving her hand in front of the lens. "You froze. Probably that terrible Italian internet." "I am here," I said. My voice was steady, but my mind was working at 1,000 miles an hour. "Well, we have to go," Richard said, straightening up. "We have a tasting menu to approve. 7 courses. Truffles flown in from France. You know how it is." "Oh, wait, no you don't." He laughed again, a wet, arrogant sound. "Enjoy the grapes," Farmer Richard said. He reached out and ended the call. The screen went black. I sat there in the silence of the Tuscan night. The crickets were still chirping. The air was still sweet. But the dynamic had changed completely. I did not move for a long time. I replayed the image in my mind. The red folder. The liquidation code. Richard Blake was funding this wedding, the invitation, the dress, the senator's venue, with money that did not exist. He was likely using the deposits from new investors to pay the minimums on debts that were already in default. He was robbing Peter to pay Paul, but Paul was already calling the police. And Oakhaven. I stood up and walked to the edge of the terrace. I looked out over my vineyard. If Richard was in default with Cayman National, it meant his assets were distressed. It meant his creditors were looking to offload his bad debt for pennies on the dollar just to get it off their books. I pulled out my phone again. I did not call Patricia. I dialed Sullivan, my lawyer in New York. It was mid-afternoon there. Sullivan answered on the first ring. "Mr. Caldwell." "Sullivan," I said. "I need you to run a search on a Cayman entity linked to Blake Developments. Look for a liquidation filing. And Sullivan, get me the contact information for the distressed asset manager at Cayman National." There was a pause on the line. I heard the clicking of keys. "What are we looking for?" Henry Sullivan asked. "We are looking for leverage," I said. "And Sullivan, find out who holds the mortgage on the Grand Oakhaven estate. If Richard booked it, he had to put down a deposit. If he used a credit line from that Cayman account, the venue contract is likely tied to the frozen assets." "You think he is going to lose the venue?" Sullivan asked. "No," I said, looking at the moon rising over the hills. "I think I am going to buy the venue." I hung up. Patricia wanted a wedding at the most exclusive estate on Long Island. She wanted a day that everyone would remember. I was going to give it to her. I walked back into my farmhouse. I opened a bottle of my own wine, the vintage we had just bottled. I poured a glass. To the happy couple, I whispered to the empty room. The game had just moved from checkers to chess, and I was the only one who knew we were playing. The morning sun was just beginning to burn the mist off the Tuscan hills when I dialed the number for New York. It was midnight there. I knew Sullivan would be in his office. He was a creature of the night, a lawyer who operated best when the rest of the city was asleep. He answered on the first ring, his voice gravelly with coffee and fatigue, but sharp with anticipation. "I have the files in front of me," Henry Sullivan said. "I have been looking at them for 3 hours. I do not even know what to call it. It is not just fraud. It is a masterpiece of stupidity." I took a sip of my espresso. It was strong and bitter, just the way I liked it. I had my laptop open on the heavy oak table, the screen glowing with the same spreadsheets Sullivan was looking at 4,000 miles away. "Walk me through the cash flow, Sullivan," I said. "Tell me what you see in the Jersey City project." Sullivan rustled some papers. I hear the sound of a highlighter squeaking across a page. "Okay, so he raised $15 million from a pension fund in Ohio for a mixed-use development," Sullivan said. "That was 6 months ago. The money hit the account on the 1st of February. By the 3rd of February, $4 million was wire transferred to a shell company in Delaware called Blue Horizon Consulting. And who owns Blue Horizon, I asked, even though I already knew the answer. Richard Blake Sullivan said. Or rather, a trust in his name. And from Blue Horizon, the money went to pay off the bridge loan on the Miami condo project, which was about to default. Exactly, I said. I leaned back in my chair, watching a hawk circle the vineyard. He is using new money to pay old debts. It is a classic Ponzi structure, Sullivan. He is not building buildings. He is building a pyramid of debt. He has to keep bringing in new investors just to keep the lights on. If the music stops for even 1 second, the whole thing collapses. And the music is about to stop, Sullivan said. I am looking at the burn rate here, Henry. Between the wedding deposits, the lifestyle costs, and the interest payments on the hard money loans, he is bleeding about $200,000 a week. He is insolvent. Technically, he has been insolvent for 2 years. I scrolled down to the section of the spreadsheet labeled Grand Oak Haven Estate. This was the part that mattered. This was the emotional leverage. Now look at the venue, Sullivan, I said. Look at the asset sheet for Oak Haven. There was a long silence on the line. I could hear the hum of the air conditioner in his high-rise office. I could hear him breathing as he read the fine print of the mortgage documents we had unearthed. My God, Sullivan whispered. He did not rent it. No, I said. He did not. He is a minority partner, Sullivan said, his voice rising in disbelief. He owns a 20% stake in the holding company that owns the estate. But look at this, Henry. Look at the lien he filed last month. I am looking at it, I said. It is a cross-collateralization agreement. He pledged the entire estate, Sullivan said. He pledged the whole property, 100% of it, as collateral for a $3 million personal loan from a private equity firm in Connecticut. Does he even have the authority to do that? No, I said. He forged the signatures of the other partners. I have the handwriting analysis already queued up. It is a clumsy forgery, Sullivan. He used the same pen pressure for all 4 signatures. This is prison time, Henry Sullivan said. This is federal. If the other partners find out. They will find out eventually, I said. But right now, that is not our concern. Our concern is the lender, the private equity firm in Connecticut. What is their status? Sullivan typed something into his keyboard. They are aggressive, he said. They filed a notice of default 3 days ago. Richard missed the first payment. They are preparing to accelerate the loan. They want to seize the property. They are going to foreclose on the Grand Oak Haven estate the week of the wedding. I closed my eyes for a second, visualizing the scene. Patricia in her dress standing on the lawn while the sheriff put a padlock on the gate. It would be a tragedy. Or a comedy, depending on where you were sitting. I do not want them to foreclose Sullivan, I said quietly. Sullivan paused. You want to save him? You want to bail him out? No, I said. I want to be the one who forecloses. I stood up and walked to the edge of the terrace. The air was warming up. The day was beginning. Here is what we are going to do, Sullivan. I want you to contact that private equity firm in Connecticut. Call them now. Wake them up if you have to. Tell them you represent a distressed asset fund called the Aurora Trust. Aurora, Sullivan said. That is the shell company you used to buy the vineyard. Correct, I said. It is clean, it is anonymous, and it is very liquid. Tell them Aurora is willing to buy the non-performing note on the Oak Haven estate. Offer them 100 cents on the dollar for the principal. Tell them we will take the headache off their hands. We will handle the legal fees. We will handle the eviction. We just want the paper. They will take that deal in a heartbeat, Sullivan said. They just want their money back. They do not want to manage a wedding venue. Exactly, I said. And Sullivan, there is more. I want you to look at the other debts. The credit lines from Cayman National. The mortgage on the penthouse. The car leases. I want Aurora to buy everything. I want to buy every single dollar of debt that Richard Blake owes to anyone in this world, Henry Sullivan said, and there was a note of warning in his voice. This is going to cost millions. You are throwing good money after bad. You will never recover this cash from Richard. He is dry. I am not investing in Richard, I said, gripping the stone railing of the balcony. I am investing in justice. I am buying the right to stand in that room and be the only person who matters. When I own his debt, I own him. I own the shirt on his back. I own the ring on Patricia's finger. I own the ground they are standing on. I watched a worker in the vineyard below starting to prune the vines. He was methodical. Chop, 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 removing what was dead to save what was living. Do it, Sullivan, I said. Wire the funds from the Zurich account. I want the paperwork signed and notarized by the end of the business day in New York. By the time Richard wakes up this morning to drink his green juice and lie to my son, I want to be his landlord, his banker, and his executioner. Sullivan let out a low whistle. You are a cold son of a bitch, Henry, he said, but I could hear the admiration in his voice. I have never seen a hostile takeover like this. It is surgical. It is forensic, I corrected him. We are not killing him, Sullivan. We are just auditing him. We are balancing the books. Patricia wanted a man who could give her the world. Well, I am buying her world. I am going to hold the deed to her happiness. Is there anything else? Henry Sullivan asked. Yes, I said. Once the papers are signed, I want you to file an emergency motion with the court. Do not serve it to Richard yet. Keep it in your briefcase. But have the foreclosure order stamped and ready. I want the power to shut down that wedding with a single phone call, but I do not want to use it until the moment is perfect. When is the moment? Sullivan asked. When they say I do, I said. I hung up the phone. My hand was not shaking. My pulse was slow. I felt a strange sense of clarity. For months, I had been the victim. I had been the discarded husband, the boring accountant, the man who wasn't enough. But now I was something else. I was the bank. And the bank always wins. I went back inside the farmhouse. I opened the safe in my study and took out a small velvet box. Inside was my old wedding ring, a simple gold band. I looked at it for a long time. Then I dropped it into the trash can next to my desk. I did not need it anymore. I had a new contract now. I sat back down at the computer. I pulled up the guest list for the wedding, which I had extracted from the wedding planner's insecure server. I saw the names of senators, business tycoons, socialites, people who judged worth by net worth, people who thought Richard Blake was one of them. I scrolled down to the name Henry Caldwell. It wasn't there. I wasn't invited. I typed my name into the spreadsheet. I added a new column, role owner. I closed the laptop. The sun was fully up now, flooding the valley with golden light. It was going to be a beautiful day in Tuscany, and in New York it was going to be a very expensive morning for the Aurora Trust. I went to the kitchen to make breakfast. I made eggs and toast just like I did every morning. Simple. Frugal. But as I ate, I smiled, because I knew something that nobody else knew. I knew that the ground beneath the Grand Oakhaven estate was shifting. I knew that the foundation was cracking, and I knew that I was the one holding the sledgehammer. The purchase would go through by noon. By dinner time, I would own the venue. By the weekend, I would own the groom. Patricia wanted drama. She wanted a story to tell her friends. I was going to give her a story that would never end. I was going to give her a masterclass in forensic accounting, and the tuition was going to be everything she had. While Richard was busy trying to keep his sinking ship afloat by bailing out water with a teaspoon, my son Brandon was walking into the most dangerous room in America. It was not a burning building or a war zone. It was a title company conference room on Wall Street. I watched the event unfold through the digital eyes of the notary public, who was actually an associate of Sullivan's firm. We had eyes everywhere now. The closing was scheduled for 10 in the morning. Brandon arrived wearing a suit that was too tight and a watch that was too heavy. He looked the part of the young, successful man he desperately wanted to be. He did not look like a man who was about to sign his life away. Richard was there, of course. He had to be. He was the puppet master. He was wearing his signature power tie and smelling of expensive cologne and desperation. To the untrained eye, he looked like a benevolent stepfather helping his boy get a foothold on the property ladder. To me, he looked like a vampire sitting next to a blood bank. The stack of documents on the table was 3 inches thick. Anyone who has bought a house knows the drill. It is a mountain of legal jargon disclosures and binding agreements. A prudent man reads every page. A careful man asks questions. I had taught Brandon to be a prudent man. I had taught him to read the fine print, because the large print giveth, but the small print taketh away. But Brandon was not listening to my voice anymore. He was listening to Richard. "Just sign by the tabs, kid," Richard said, tapping the table impatiently. "The lawyers have looked at all of this. It is just boilerplate, standard procedure. We have a lunch reservation at Nobu in an hour, so let's chop. Brandon laughed. He picked up the pen. It was a Mont Blanc that Richard had handed him, a prop for the performance. "I trust you," Richard, Brandon said. "You are the expert." I watched the video feed on my laptop in Tuscany, and I felt a physical pain in my chest. It was not anger. It was the crushing weight of disappointment. My son was committing financial suicide, and he was doing it with a smile because he was too lazy to do the work. He was too enamored with the idea of the house to care about the reality of the debt. He signed the first document, the deed of trust. That was standard. He signed the second document, the mortgage note, also standard. Then came the third document. Richard slid it across the table seamlessly. He buried it under a disclosure form about lead paint. "This one is just for the insurance," Richard said casually. "Just an indemnity thing. Sign here." Brandon did not even look at the header. He did not see the words personal guarantee and unsecured credit line authorization. He did not see the interest rate, which was set at 24%. He just signed his name with a flourish. Brandon Vance. With that signature, he did not just buy a house. He authorized Richard to open a line of credit in Brandon's name. A shadow line. A line that Richard intended to use to pay for the catering and the flowers and the orchestra at the Oak Haven wedding. Richard was tapped out. His credit was frozen. He needed a fresh host. And he had found one in my son. I wanted to scream through the screen. I wanted to smash the laptop and fly to New York and shake Brandon until his teeth rattled. I wanted to yell, "Read the paper, you fool, look at what you are doing." But I sat still. I took a sip of water. I forced myself to remember why I was doing this. If I intervened now, Brandon would never learn. He would always be the boy who needed saving. He would always be the victim. He needed to feel the fire to understand that it burns. The signing continued. Richard was smooth. He was operating on pure adrenaline. He knew that if Brandon paused for even a second, if he asked one question, the whole scheme would unravel. So Richard kept talking. He talked about the pool parties they would have at the new house. He talked about the neighbors who were investment bankers and models. He filled the air with noise so that Brandon could not hear the sound of the trap snapping shut. And then came the final document, the one that sealed the coffin. It was a cross-collateralization agreement. It linked Brandon's new house to Richard's existing debts. It essentially said that if Richard defaulted on his loans, the bank could come after Brandon's house. "This is just a formality," Richard said, yawning. "It links our portfolios so we get a better interest rate. It is how families build wealth together. We leverage each other's assets." Brandon hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Does this mean I am liable for your business, Richard?" he asked. Richard laughed. A deep, booming laugh that echoed in the small room. Liable kid, I am worth $50 million. If anything, I am liable for you. I am doing you a favor here. I am letting you ride my coattails. Do not overthink it. Do you want the keys or not? Brandon nodded. He looked ashamed for even asking. Sorry, he said. Dad used to say, never cosign. Richard's face hardened. Your dad is renting a farm in Italy, Brandon. I am buying a city block. Who do you want to listen to? Brandon signed. It was done. In that moment, my son became the primary debtor for a wedding that cost more than he made in 5 years. He became the owner of a house that was already underwater because it was anchored to Richard's sinking ship. He became a pawn. They stood up, shook hands with the title officer. Richard slapped Brandon on the back. Congratulations, homeowner, Richard said. You are a man now. They walked out of the room, leaving the stack of signed papers on the table. The notary scanned them immediately and uploaded them to the secure server, where Sullivan accessed them within minutes. I opened the files. I looked at Brandon's signature. It was shaky. Subconsciously, he knew he had made a mistake, but consciously, he was walking to Nobu to eat sushi with a con artist. I forwarded the documents to my team. Add these to the portfolio, I wrote. When we foreclose on Richard, we foreclose on everything, including the assets of his guarantors. It was a ruthless order. It felt cold typing it. But I knew the timeline. The wedding was in 3 days. Richard would max out these new credit lines within 24 hours. He would drain Brandon's credit dry to put on the final show. And when the dust settled, Brandon would be left with nothing but a lesson. A very expensive lesson about the difference between a father who tells you the hard truth and a predator who tells you a sweet lie. I closed the laptop. The sun was setting over the vineyard. The shadows were long and dark. I had lost my son a long time ago. I lost him when I stopped buying him toys and started trying to teach him responsibility. I lost him when he decided that glitter was more valuable than gold. Now I was going to have to break him to get him back. I went to the cellar. I checked the barrels. The wine was aging. It was developing character in the dark. That is how it works. You have to crush the grapes to get the wine. You have to endure the pressure and the darkness to become something of value. Brandon was in the crusher now, and Richard was turning the handle. I went back upstairs and packed my bag. My suit was pressed. My ticket was booked. It was time to go to New York. It was time to attend a wedding. I looked at the empty farmhouse one last time. When I returned, I would not be alone, or I would be alone forever. The dice were thrown. The papers were signed. I turned off the lights. The silent American was leaving Italy. The auditor was coming home. The silence in the farmhouse that night was different. Usually, the silence of the Tuscan countryside was peaceful, a gentle blanket that settled over the hills after the sun went down. But tonight, the silence felt heavy. It felt charged like the air before a summer thunderstorm, when the pressure drops and the birds stop singing. I sat at my heavy oak desk with only the glow of my laptop screen illuminating the room. My luggage was already packed, standing by the door like a soldier waiting for deployment. I was not waiting for a taxi. I was waiting for a confirmation code. I had wired $12 million from the Aurora Trust at 9 a.m. New York time. It was a staggering amount of money. It was more than I had made in my first 20 years of practice. To anyone else, it would have been a gamble. To me, it was a purchase order for justice. I was buying the exclusive rights to be the villain in their story, so that I could eventually be the hero in my own. The cursor on the screen blinked. One blink for every second that Richard Blake was still sleeping soundly in his stolen life. One blink for every lie Patricia had told herself about her new happiness. One blink for every signature my son Brandon had put on a document he did not understand. Then it happened. The email client refreshed. A single new message appeared at the top of the inbox. The subject line was 3 words: Transaction execution confirmed. I opened it. I did not rush. I clicked the mouse with the steady hand of a surgeon making the first incision. The body of the email was from the senior partner at the Connecticut private equity firm. It was brief, professional, and final. Dear Mr. Caldwell, per our agreement, the Aurora Trust is now the holder in due course of the primary mortgage note for the Grand Oak Haven estate, as well as the assignee for the entire distressed debt portfolio of Blake Developments. The transfer of title has been recorded with the county clerk. You are now the legal owner of the debt. The foreclosure instruments have been prepared and are ready for execution at your discretion. I leaned back in my chair. The wood creaked. I let out a breath I did not know I had been holding. It was done. I was no longer Henry the ex-husband. I was no longer Henry the boring accountant. I was now the landlord. I owned the roof over their heads. I owned the ground under their feet. I owned the paper that Richard had used to build his house of cards. When they walked down the aisle tomorrow, they would be walking on my property. When they cut the cake, they would be celebrating in a room that I had the legal power to lock. I printed the document. The printer whirred in the quiet room, spitting out the single sheet of paper that was worth more than Richard's entire existence. I folded it precisely in thirds. I placed it in the inside pocket of my passport holder. I stood up and walked to the back of the room where my wardrobe stood. I opened the doors. Hanging there in the back, covered in a protective plastic bag, was a suit I had not worn since I left Chicago. It was a charcoal gray Armani custom, tailored for me in Milan 5 years ago. It was not the suit of a farmer. It was not the suit of a retiree. It was the uniform of a man who commands boardrooms. The fabric was cold to the touch. I took it out and laid it on the bed. I set up the ironing board. This was a ritual. I filled the iron with water and waited for it to heat up. When the steam hissed, I began to press the fabric. Back and forth, back and forth. The heat smoothed out the wrinkles. It erased the creases of time. With every pass of the iron, I felt myself changing. The soft edges of the man who had tended vines in the sunlight were hardening. The calluses on my hands were hidden now, but the steel in my spine was exposed. I ironed the shirt until it was crisp enough to cut glass. I polished my black Oxfords until I could see my own reflection in the leather. I looked at that reflection. The eyes staring back were not sad. They were focused. They were the eyes of a wolf that has finished tracking its prey and is now preparing to spring. I checked my phone. I opened the airline app. I had booked the ticket an hour ago. One way. Florence to JFK first class. Seat 1A. Patricia and Richard thought I was counting pennies. They thought I was sitting in a crumbling farmhouse eating bread and cheese, lamenting my lost status. They had no idea that I was flying toward them in a seat that cost more than her wedding dress. They had no idea that the man coming for them was not coming to beg for a seat at the table, but to repossess the table itself. I finished packing. I placed the suit in the garment bag with care. I put my laptop in my leather briefcase, the same briefcase I had carried during the Enron audits. It was battered, but it was strong, just like me. I walked out onto the terrace one last time. The moon was high now. The vineyard was silver in the light. I would miss this peace. I would miss the simple, honest work of the earth. But some weeds are too deep to be pulled by hand. Some rot requires fire. I looked at the time. My driver would be here in 20 minutes. I poured the last of the wine down the sink. I did not need liquid courage. I had the law. I picked up my phone and looked at the last text message Brandon had sent me. It was a photo of him and Richard at the bachelor party holding expensive cigars. The caption read, "Living the good life, Dad." Wish you could understand. I deleted the message. I understand perfectly, son, I whispered to the empty room. I understand that the bill always comes due, and I am the one bringing the check. I turned off the lights. The farmhouse plunged into darkness. I walked out the door and locked it behind me. The gravel crunched under my feet as I walked to the gate. I did not look back. The storm was not coming from the sky. The storm was sitting in the back of a black sedan heading for the airport. The storm was wearing a bespoke suit and carrying a foreclosure notice. And when it made landfall in New York, nothing would be left standing. The sun began to set over Long Island Sound, painting the sky in shades of violet and gold that money cannot buy, but the scene on the lawn of the grand Oak Haven estate was trying very hard to outshine nature itself. From my vantage point on the security monitors inside the estate manager's office, I could see every detail of the production. And it was a production. It was not a wedding. It was a theatrical performance designed to convince the world that Patricia Caldwell and Richard Blake were American royalty. The air was thick with the scent of 5,000 white hydrangeas imported from Holland that morning. I looked at the invoice on my screen. $12,000 for flowers that would be dead by tomorrow. Tables were draped in heavy Irish linen and set with crystal stemware that caught the last rays of the sun. A 12-piece string orchestra was playing Mozart near the rose garden, their music drifting over the manicured grass like a lullaby for the wealthy. And there was Patricia. She was standing near the champagne tower, a pyramid of crystal coupes that was being filled by a waiter pouring Dom Perignon from a magnum bottle. She was wearing a custom Vera Wang gown that I knew cost more than the average American earns in a year. It was silk and lace tight at the bodice and flowing at the skirt, designed to make a 60-year-old woman look 30. She looked radiant. I have to give her that. She looked like a woman who had won the lottery. She was holding court surrounded by a circle of women who were hanging on her every word. I zoomed in on her face. Her eyes were bright. Her smile was triumphant. She was gesturing with her left hand, making sure the light caught the diamond ring that Richard had bought with stolen money. I could read her lips. She was telling them about the honeymoon. We are taking a private jet to the Maldives, she was saying. Richard says commercial travel is just too exhausting. She believed it. That was the tragedy of it. She truly believed that she had escaped the mundane life I had provided for her. She thought she had traded a Honda for a Ferrari. She did not know that the Ferrari had no engine and no brakes. She was drinking the champagne and letting the bubbles go to her head, intoxicated by her own perceived success. She was the queen of the manor, unaware that the king had already lost the war. But Richard knew. While Patricia was floating on a cloud of delusion, Richard was drowning in reality. He was standing near the entrance to the main tent, ostensibly greeting guests. He looked the part in his tuxedo, his hair slicked back, his smile fixed in place like a mask. But I was watching his hands. His right hand was in his pocket, clutching his phone like a lifeline. Every 30 seconds he would pull it out and glance at the screen. I knew exactly what he was seeing because I was seeing the mirror image on my laptop. Notification. Wire transfer failed. Notification. Vendor payment declined. Notification. Urgent message from the catering company manager asking why the final balance had not cleared. I zoomed in on his face. Beads of sweat were forming on his forehead, just below his hairline. He wiped them away with a monogrammed handkerchief. His eyes were darting around the crowd, not looking for friends, but looking for threats. He was looking for the caterer. He was looking for the venue manager. He was looking for anyone who might walk up to him and whisper that the credit card had been rejected. A waiter walked by with a tray of hors d'oeuvres. Richard grabbed a glass of scotch. He downed it in one gulp. His hand was shaking slightly. My son Brandon walked up to him. Brandon looked happy, oblivious. He clapped Richard on the back. "Great party," Richard Brandon said. Everyone is talking about the ice sculpture. Richard flinched. He forced a laugh that sounded more like a cough. Glad you like it, kid, Richard said. Listen, do me a favor. If the band leader asks for me, tell him I am dealing with a VIP guest, and I will settle up with him later, okay? Just keep him off my back. Brandon nodded eagerly. Sure thing, Richard. You are the boss. Richard patted Brandon's shoulder, but his eyes were already back on his phone. He was typing furiously now, probably trying to move funds from one empty account to another, trying to perform financial alchemy before the salad course was served. He walked away from Brandon, moving toward the edge of the lawn, away from the guests. He needed signal. He needed a miracle. I switched the camera feed to the one covering the east garden. Richard was pacing back and forth, his voice low and urgent as he spoke into the phone. I do not care what the screen says, he hissed. I deposited the check this morning. You have to override the hold. I have 200 people here. If the card declines again, I will sue your bank into the ground. Do you know who I am? I sat in the cool silence of the office and took a sip of water. I knew who he was. He was a man who had 5 minutes left on the clock. Back on the main lawn, Patricia was laughing. She threw her head back, exposing her neck to the evening breeze. She grabbed Richard's arm as he returned from his frantic phone call. She pulled him into the center of the circle. Here he is, she announced. The man of the hour. My hero. Richard smiled. It was a ghastly thing, a grimace that barely covered his teeth. He put his arm around Patricia's waist, but his grip was too tight. He was holding on to her not out of affection, but because she was the only thing keeping him upright. Ladies and gentlemen, Patricia called out, raising her glass. The music stopped. The guests turned to look at them. I just want to propose a toast before we sit down for dinner, Patricia said. To taking chances. To never settling for less than you deserve. And to living a life that is as big and bold as your dreams. The crowd cheered. Glasses clinked. Hear, hear, someone shouted. Richard raised his glass, but he did not drink. He was looking toward the driveway. He was looking at the long, winding road that led up to the estate. He was waiting for the other shoe to drop. He expected a repo man. He expected an angry vendor. He did not expect me. The sun finally dipped below the horizon, plunging the estate into a soft twilight. The string lights above the dance floor flickered on, creating a canopy of stars. It was a perfect scene. It was the peak of the illusion. Patricia leaned in and kissed Richard on the cheek. It is perfect, she whispered. Everything is perfect. Richard looked at her. For a second, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. He knew that the catering manager was walking toward them with a grim look on his face. He knew that the house of cards was swaying in the wind. Let's go sit down, Richard said quickly, trying to steer her away. Let's get dinner started. But it was too late for dinner. I stood up from my chair in the office. I buttoned my jacket. I adjusted my cuff. I picked up the leather folder containing the deed and the foreclosure order. The show was over. It was time for the reviews. I walked out of the office and down the long marble hallway that led to the French doors opening onto the lawn. I could hear the murmur of the crowd. I could hear the clinking of silverware. Patricia thought she was at the summit of her life. Richard thought he was navigating a crisis. Neither of them knew that they were already ghosts haunting a house they no longer had the right to enter. I pushed open the doors. The cool air hit my face. I stepped out onto the terrace overlooking the party. From my position, I was a silhouette against the light of the house, a shadow looming over their celebration. I took the first step down the stairs. The sound of my leather shoes on the stone was lost under the music, but my presence was about to be felt by everyone. The champagne was flowing. The laughter was loud. The happiness was fake, and I was the reality check. The sound of my leather Oxfords striking the marble of the terrace was a sharp, rhythmic cadence that cut through the humid evening air. I walked slowly. I walked with the deliberate pace of a man who owns the ground he is walking on. The conversation at the nearest tables died out first. It was a ripple effect. One by one, the guests turned to see what had silenced their neighbors. They expected perhaps a celebrity or a politician. What they saw was me. But they did not see the Henry Caldwell they thought they knew. They did not see the man in the ill-fitting department store suit who sat in the corner at parties nursing a single drink to make it last. They saw a man in a bespoke charcoal Armani suit that fit like armor. They saw a man with a posture of steel and eyes that held the cold, absolute authority of a judge delivering a death sentence. I stepped off the terrace and onto the grass. The crowd parted. It was instinctual. Human beings are hardwired to recognize power, and in that moment I was radiating it. I walked straight toward the head table, where Richard and Patricia were frozen in a tableau of panic and confusion. Patricia was the first to speak. She dropped her champagne glass. It hit the grass with a dull thud, spilling vintage Dom Perignon onto her Vera Wang hem. "Henry," she whispered. Her voice was trembling. "What are you doing here? You were in Italy. You look different." I did not look at her. My gaze was fixed on Richard. He was standing with his back to the band, his face a mask of red fury that was rapidly draining into pale fear. He knew the wolves were at the door, but he had not expected the alpha wolf to be his wife's ex-husband. Richard straightened his jacket. He tried to summon the arrogance that had carried him through 65 years of mediocrity. He stepped forward, blocking my path to Patricia. "What is the meaning of this?" he barked. His voice cracked slightly, betraying him. "This is a private event, Henry. You are trespassing. I ought to have you thrown out on the street where you belong." "Security." He looked around wildly, waving his hand for the estate security guards. Two large men in black suits started to move toward me from the perimeter. Patricia recovered her voice. She stepped up beside Richard, clutching his arm. "Henry, please," she hissed. "Do not make a scene. We are happy. Can't you just let us be happy? If you need money, we can write you a check. Just go. You are embarrassing yourself." I stopped. I stood 3 feet from them. I looked at the diamond on her finger. I looked at the sweat on Richard's brow. I looked at my son Brandon, who was standing off to the side, his mouth open, his eyes wide with shock. "I am not here for money, Patricia," I said. My voice was low, but in the silence of the lawn it carried to the back rows. "And I am not here to make a scene. I am here to correct an accounting error." Richard laughed. It was a nervous, desperate sound. "Accounting error," he scoffed. "Listen to him. Once a bean counter, always a bean counter. Get out of here, Henry, before I drag you out myself." He reached out to grab my lapel. It was a mistake. Before his hand could touch the fabric of my suit, a voice rang out from the terrace behind me. It was a voice of pure granite. "I would advise against touching him, Mr. Blake. That would be assault. And considering your current legal standing, adding a violent felony to the list would be unwise." Richard froze. He looked over my shoulder. Walking down the stairs was Sullivan. He was not alone. Flanking him were 2 uniformed officers from the Suffolk County Sheriff's Department, and a woman in a gray suit holding a briefcase. She was the representative from the bank that held the original note. The guests gasped. The murmur of confusion turned into a buzz of alarm. Police at a wedding is never a good sign. Police at a wedding of a high-profile developer is a scandal. Richard's face turned the color of ash. He recognized the uniforms. He recognized the look on Sullivan's face. "Who are you?" Richard demanded, stepping back. "What is this?" Sullivan walked up to us. He stopped next to me. He did not look at Richard. He handed me a blue folder. "Mr. Blake," Sullivan said, "my name is Thomas Sullivan. I am the attorney representing the Aurora Trust, and these officers are here to enforce a court order issued this afternoon by the New York Supreme Court." Richard began to stamina. Court order. For what? I paid the venue fee. I have the receipt. This is harassment. I will have your badges. I know the mayor. The woman in the gray suit stepped forward. She adjusted her glasses. Mr. Blake, she said calmly, your check for the venue rental was returned for insufficient funds 3 days ago. The wire transfer you attempted this morning was flagged for fraud, but that is actually the least of your problems. Richard looked like he was going to vomit. Patricia let go of his arm as if he were burning hot. What do you mean, fraud? Patricia asked. Her voice was thin, high-pitched. Richard told me it was a bank error. It was not an error, Mrs. Caldwell Sullivan said. He used your maiden name because he knew you would listen to him. But the reality is that Mr. Blake has been in default on the mortgage for this property for months. He forged the signatures of his partners to use this estate as collateral for a high-interest loan, a loan he never paid. Richard lunged forward. That is a lie, he screamed. I own 20% of this place. You cannot kick me out. I have rights of possession. Sullivan smiled. It was a terrifying smile. You had rights, Sullivan said, until the note was sold. The lender you defrauded was very eager to liquidate their position. They sold the entire debt portfolio, including the mortgage on this estate, to a private investor this morning at 9 o'clock. Richard looked around the lawn. He looked at the guests who were now standing up holding their phones recording every second of his humiliation. So what, he snarled. So some vulture fund bought the debt. I will negotiate with them on Monday. Now get off my property and let me finish my wedding. I stepped forward. I closed the distance between us. I looked Richard in the eye. There will be no negotiation, Richard, I said. Richard sneered at me. Shut up, Henry. This is between men of business. Go back to your grapes. I opened the blue folder Sullivan had given me. I pulled out the deed. The paper was crisp. The stamp from the county clerk was fresh. I am a man of business, Richard, I said, and business is concluded. I held up the document. I turned slightly so that Patricia could see it, so that Brandon could see it, so that the senators and the bankers in the audience could see the gold seal at the bottom. The Aurora Trust is not a vulture fund, I said. It is a family trust, my family trust. Patricia's hand flew to her mouth. A small, strangled sound escaped her throat. What she whispered. I bought the debt, Patricia, I said. I bought the mortgage. I bought the liens. I bought the personal guarantees. I bought every single dime of debt that Richard Blake owes to the world. I turned back to Richard. He was shaking his head slowly, back and forth, like a man trying to wake up from a nightmare. No, he mumbled. You do not have that kind of money. You are a pensioner. You are a nobody. I was a forensic accountant for 40 years, Richard Thurster said. I know where the money is hidden. And more importantly, I know where it is not. You have nothing. You are insolvent. You are bankrupt. And as of this morning, you are trespassing. I signaled to the sheriff. Sullivan stepped forward to deliver the final blow. He raised his voice so that it carried over the silent, terrified crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced, I apologize for the interruption, but under the strict terms of the foreclosure agreement, which was executed and recorded today, the ownership of the Grand Oakhaven estate has transferred. Sullivan paused. He looked at Richard with pity. The previous owner has been evicted, and the new owner has a very strict policy regarding the use of his property. Sullivan turned to me. He bowed his head slightly. Mr. Caldwell, the floor is yours. I looked at Patricia. She was crying now, black mascara running down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. She looked old. She looked tired. She looked at me not with hatred, but with a sudden, terrifying clarity. She realized that for 30 years she had been sleeping next to a lion, thinking he was a house cat. I looked at Brandon. He was pale, leaning against a table for support, realizing that the man he called a genius was a fraud, and the father he called a failure was the master. I looked at Richard. He was finished. The police were moving in handcuffs visible on their belts. I took a deep breath. The air smelled of expensive flowers and cheap lies. According to the terms of the asset seizure, I said, my voice steady and cold, I am exercising my right to secure the property immediately. I looked Richard dead in the eye. I do not allow strangers to party in my house. I turned to the head of security who was standing confused by the stage. Turn off the music, I ordered. Clear the lawn. You have 30 minutes to vacate the premises before I have every vehicle towed. The security guard looked at Richard. Richard said nothing. He just stared at the ground. The guard looked at me. He saw the suit. He saw the lawyer. He saw the deed. Yes, sir, the guard said. He spoke into his radio. Cut the sound. Party is over. Everyone out. The music died with a screech of feedback. The lights on the dance floor went black. The only light left came from the setting sun, casting long shadows across the ruins of the wedding that never was. Patricia reached out for me. Henry, please, she sobbed. Where will we go? I looked at her and I felt nothing. The anger was gone. The love was gone. There was only the math. That is a variable you should have calculated, Patricia, I said. I turned my back on them. I walked back toward the house, leaving the chaos behind me. I walked past the stunned guests who parted for me like the Red Sea. I did not stop. I did not look back. I had balanced the books, and the bottom line was 0. The silence that descended on the lawn of the Grand Oakhaven estate was heavier than the humid night air. It was a physical weight pressing down on 200 guests who were suddenly realizing they were not witnessing a wedding, but a crime scene. The string lights overhead flickered once and then died, leaving us illuminated only by the harsh floodlights from the security perimeter. It was a fitting lighting change. We had moved from romance to interrogation. I stood there with my hands in the pockets of my bespoke suit, watching the inevitable conclusion of Richard Blake's life. He did not go quietly. Men like Richard never do. They scream and thrash because they believe that if they make enough noise, the universe will bend to their will. You cannot do this, Richard screamed as the first officer took hold of his arm. Do you know who I am? I am a pillar of this community. This is a misunderstanding, a clerical error. Call my lawyer. Call the mayor. The officer did not call the mayor. He calmly twisted Richard's arm behind his back. The sound of the handcuffs ratcheting shut was a sharp mechanical click that echoed across the terrified silence. It was the sound of a ledger closing. Mr. Blake, the officer said, his voice bored and professional. You are under arrest for wire fraud, bank fraud, and grand larceny. You have the right to remain silent. I suggest you use it. Richard looked at the crowd. He looked at the senators and the CEOs he had invited to witness his triumph. He was pleading with his eyes, begging them to intervene. But they all did the same thing. They looked away. They checked their phones. They took a sudden interest in their shoes. In the world of the elite, failure is contagious, and nobody wanted to catch what Richard had. Then the screaming started. It was Patricia. The shock had worn off, replaced by the raw, primal panic of a woman watching her future being hauled away in chrome bracelets. She lunged toward the police officers, grabbing at Richard's sleeve. No, she shrieked. You are making a mistake. He is wealthy. He owns buildings. We are going to the Maldives tomorrow. You cannot arrest the groom. One of the officers gently but firmly pushed her back. Ma'am, step back, or you will be arrested for obstruction of justice. Patricia stumbled back, her high heels sinking into the soft grass. She lost her balance and fell to her knees. Her Vera Wang dress, the symbol of her new life, was now stained with dirt and grass. She looked up and her eyes found me. Henry. It was a cry for help. It was a demand. It was the voice she had used for 35 years when she wanted me to fix a leaking pipe or pay a bill she had forgotten. "Henry, do something," she sobbed, crawling toward me. Tell them this is a mistake. You are an accountant. You can explain the numbers. Help him. Help us." I looked down at her. I saw the woman I had loved. I saw the woman who had nursed me when I was sick. But I also saw the woman who had called me boring. The woman who had looked at my life's work and called it small. "I cannot help him, Patricia," I said, my voice devoid of any warmth. "The numbers do not lie. Richard has been spending money he does not have for 5 years. The wedding ring on your finger is evidence in a federal investigation. The dress you are wearing was bought with stolen funds." Patricia looked at the ring. She tried to pull it off, but her hands were shaking so badly she couldn't. "But us," she cried. "Henry, we were family. Doesn't that mean anything to you?" "It means everything to me," I said. "That is why I am here, to make sure the family accounts are balanced." I turned my gaze to the side where my son Brandon was standing. He was not screaming. He was not moving. He was frozen. He was staring at Richard being shoved into the back of a squad car, his face a mask of absolute horror. "Brandon," I said. He jumped as if I had hit him. He turned to look at me. His face was pale, the color of old paper. "Dad," he whispered. "Dad." "What is happening?" Richard said. "He said he was worth 50 million. "Richard lied," I said. "But the house," Brandon stammered. "My house. The closing. We signed the papers yesterday." I signaled to Sullivan. My lawyer stepped forward, opening his briefcase again. He pulled out a document that was not a deed. It was a subpoena. Brandon Sullivan said, his voice soft but firm. "I am afraid I have some bad news for you. When you signed those papers yesterday, you did not just buy a house. You signed a cross-collateralization agreement with Richard's shell company." Brandon blinked. "I do not understand." "It means," Sullivan continued, "that you pledged your new home and your personal credit as security for Richard's debts. Now that Richard has defaulted, the bank has the right to call in all guarantees." Brandon looked at me, his eyes filling with tears. "What does that mean, Dad?" "It means," I said, stepping closer to him, "that you are bankrupt, Brandon. The house is gone. Your credit score is 0. You are liable for the wedding costs, the catering, even the flowers that are wilting right now. You signed your name next to a con man because you were too lazy to read the fine print." Brandon's knees buckled. He grabbed the edge of a table to hold himself up. "Fix it," he begged. "Dad, you have money now. You bought the estate. You can pay it off. Please. I will lose my job. I will lose everything." I looked at my son. This was the moment. The moment every parent dreads, but every parent must face. The moment when saving your child is the worst thing you can do for them. "I could write a check," I said. "I could pay off your debt, Brandon. It would be easy for me." "Then do it," he cried. "Please, Dad. I am your son." "No," I said. The word hung in the air. "If I pay it," I said, "you will never learn. You will always be the boy who looks for the easy way out." "You wanted to learn about other people's money. Well, now you are going to learn about your own responsibility." "But where will I go?" Brandon whispered. "I do not know," I said. "That is for you to figure out. You are a man, Brandon. Start acting like one." I turned away from him. It was the hardest thing I have ever done. I heard him sobbing behind me. I heard Patricia screaming my name. I heard the sirens wailing as Richard was driven away. The guests were fleeing now, scuttling toward the parking lot like cockroaches when the kitchen light is turned on. They wanted to distance themselves from the disaster. They were deleting photos from their phones, erasing their association with the fallen king. I stood alone in the center of the lawn, the master of the estate, the owner of the ruin. Sullivan walked up to me, closing his briefcase. "The police have cleared the building, Henry," he said. "The catering staff is asking if they should pack up the food." "Tell them to donate it to the homeless shelter in the city," I said. "At least someone should get a good meal out of this mess." And Mrs. Caldwell Sullivan asked, "And your son?" "Security is asking if they should be removed." I looked at the huddled figures of my ex-wife and my son. They were sitting on a bench near the fountain, holding each other in the wreckage of their vanity. "Give them 10 minutes," I said. "Then escort them to the gate. They can call an Uber." I walked toward the French doors of the mansion. I entered the grand ballroom where the reception was supposed to be held. It was empty. The tables were set. The candles were unlit. It was a ghost ship. I walked to the bar and poured myself a glass of water. My hands were steady. My heart was calm. I had done it. I had executed the plan to the letter. I had stripped them of their illusions. I had forced them to look in the mirror. But as I stood there in the silent, cavernous room, I did not feel triumph. I felt a profound sense of closure. The account was closed. The balance was zero. I took out my phone. I opened the airline app. I booked a ticket back to Florence for the next morning. I was done with America. I was done with the noise. I was ready to go back to my vines. Vines are honest. If you treat them well, they give you fruit. If you neglect them, they die. They do not lie. They do not pretend. I walked out of the front door of the mansion, leaving the door unlocked. I did not care. There was nothing in there that I wanted. As I walked down the driveway past the police cars and the fleeing guests, I saw Patricia one last time. She was standing by the gate, shivering in the night air. She looked at me, and for the first time in years, I saw respect in her eyes. It was the respect born of fear. "Goodbye, Henry," she whispered. "Goodbye, Patricia," I said without stopping. I got into the back of the waiting black sedan. "To the airport," I told the driver. The car pulled away, leaving the grand Oakhaven estate behind in the darkness. I did not look back. The rear-view mirror showed only the red taillights fading into the night. I closed my eyes. I was tired. But it was a good tired. It was the exhaustion of a job well done. The audit was complete. The drive to John F. Kennedy International Airport was quiet. I did not turn on the radio. I did not check my phone. I simply watched the lights of New York City streak past the tinted window of the limousine like shooting stars. For decades, this city had been my home. It had been the place where I built my career, where I raised my son, where I tried and failed to make my wife happy. Now, as the skyline retreated into the distance, becoming nothing more than a jagged, glowing line on the horizon, I felt a profound sense of detachment. It was as if I were leaving a theater after a long and exhausting play. The curtain had fallen. The actors had been dismissed. And I was finally walking out into the fresh air. I boarded the plane and took my seat in first class. The flight attendant offered me a glass of champagne. I accepted it. It was the same brand that Richard Blake had served at his ill-fated reception. But this glass tasted different. It did not taste like pretense. It tasted like closure. I sipped it slowly as the plane taxied down the runway. I felt the engines roar to life, the immense power pressing me back into the leather seat. And then we were airborne. I looked down at the sprawling grid of lights below. Somewhere down there in a holding cell in Queens, Richard Blake was trying to explain to a public defender how he had lost everything in a single sunset. Somewhere down there, Patricia was trying to find a hotel room that would take a credit card that hadn't been canceled. I did not feel guilt. I did not feel sorrow. I felt the cool satisfaction of an equation that had finally been balanced. I reclined my seat, and for the first time in years, I slept without dreaming. When I landed in Florence, the morning sun was hitting the terracotta roofs of the city, turning them into a sea of orange fire. I breathed in the air. It smelled of espresso and diesel and old stone. It smelled like home. My driver was waiting for me. He did not ask about my trip. In Italy, privacy is a respected commodity. We drove south into the rolling hills of Tuscany, winding our way through the cypress trees and the olive groves until the iron gates of my estate came into view. Marco, my agronomist, was waiting for me by the barn. He was holding a bunch of grapes, inspecting them for rot. He looked up and waved. "Welcome back, Mr. Caldwell," he called out. "The harvest is looking good. The sugar levels are perfect." I walked over to him. I took a grape and crushed it between my fingers. The juice was sticky and dark. "Excellent, Marco," I said. "Let us begin the harvest tomorrow." And just like that, I slipped back into my life. The suit went back into the dark corner of the closet. The leather shoes were replaced by work boots. The forensic accountant vanished, and the farmer returned. For the next week, I worked. I worked until my muscles ached. I worked until my hands were stained purple with grape juice. I worked to purge the memory of the grand Oakhaven estate from my mind. The physical labor was a balm. It grounded me. It reminded me that there are things in this world that cannot be faked. You cannot fake a harvest. You cannot lie to the soil. But I did keep one eye on the world I had left behind. Every evening after dinner, I would open my laptop and check the news from New York. It was not hard to find. The arrest of a prominent developer at his own wedding was tabloid gold. The headlines were sensational. Wedding crashed by federal agents. The Great Gatsby of Long Island exposed as fraud. Socialite bride left at the altar in handcuffs. I read the articles with clinical interest. I learned that Richard's bail had been denied because he was considered a flight risk. I learned that the forensic evidence provided by an anonymous source, me, was so overwhelming that his own lawyers were discussing a plea deal. I learned that Brandon had been fired from his job at the agency, ostensibly for performance issues, but in reality because nobody wants to trust their marketing to a man whose assets have just been frozen by a federal court order. I read these things and I felt a strange distance from them. They were just data points. They were the predictable ripples of the stone I had thrown into the pond. 7 days passed. The harvest was in full swing. The vineyard was alive with the sound of workers and the smell of crushed fruit. It was Tuesday evening. I was sitting on the terrace watching the sunset. The sky was a bruising mix of purple and red. I had a book open on my lap, but I wasn't reading. I was waiting. I knew the call would come. I had calculated the timeline. It would take about a week for the shock to wear off. It would take a week for the reality of their situation to set in. It would take a week for the anger to turn into desperation. And then my phone rang. It sat on the stone table buzzing like an angry insect. The screen lit up. The name displayed was Patricia. I looked at it. I let it ring. Once, twice, 3 times. I picked it up. I did not say hello. I just pressed the button and held the phone to my ear. I listened to the silence on the other end. It was a heavy, wet silence. I could hear breathing. I could hear the jagged intake of breath that comes after hours of crying. I waited. In a negotiation, the person who speaks first loses, and Patricia had already lost everything, so she had nothing left to trade but words. Henry. Her voice was unrecognizable. The sharp edges were gone. The haughty tone of the woman who lunched at Le Bernardin was gone. It was a small voice, a broken voice. It sounded like the voice of the girl I had met 40 years ago before the money and the ambition had hardened her heart. "Henry, are you there?" I took a sip of my wine. I looked out at the rows of vines stretching away into the darkness. "I am here, Patricia," I said. There was a sob on the other end, a raw, ugly sound. "Henry, it is gone," she whispered. "Everything is gone. The penthouse, the cars. They took my jewelry, Henry. They took the ring off my finger in the evidence room. They said it was proceeds of crime. I have nothing. I am staying in a motel in Queens. Brandon is sleeping on the floor." She paused, waiting for me to offer sympathy, waiting for me to offer a solution. But I remained silent. "Henry, please," she said. "We need help. Just enough to get an apartment. Just enough to start over. You won't miss it. You are rich now. You own everything." I closed my eyes. I remembered the way she had looked at me in the courtroom when she took the house. I remembered the way she had laughed when Richard mocked my suit. I opened my eyes. The stars were coming out over Tuscany. "I am not rich, Patricia," I said calmly. "I am just solvent. There is a difference." "Henry, don't be cruel," she begged. "We are family." I gripped the phone. "We were family," I said. "Now we are just people who used to know each other." I waited for her to speak again. I waited for the final plea. Because I knew that this conversation was the last line of the ledger, and I intended to write the final entry with a steady hand. The silence stretched between us across the ocean, a thin wire of tension, connecting the dark vineyards of Tuscany to the neon desperation of a Queen's motel room. I could hear the hum of the vending machine in the background on her end. I could hear the muffled sound of a television set through a thin wall. These were the sounds of her new reality, and they were deafening. "Henry, please," Patricia whispered, and her voice cracked under the weight of her shame. I was stupid. I was vain. I was so desperate to be envied that I let a stranger ruin us. But I have learned my lesson. I swear to you. I am looking at my hands, Henry, and they are shaking. We are sleeping on a mattress that smells like cigarette smoke. Richard is in jail, but the bail bondsman is calling me every hour. I listened to her, and I felt a strange ghost of the affection I once had. It was not love. It was pity. It was the feeling you get when you see a bird fly into a window pane. You do not blame the bird, but you know you cannot fly for it. "You have a master's degree in art history." "Patricia," I said gently, "you are capable of working. You are capable of rebuilding. It will be hard. It will be slow, but it will be real. And that is worth more than any penthouse Richard stole for you." "But Brandon," she cried, interrupting me. "Forget about me, Henry. I deserve this. But Brandon is your son. He is just a boy. He is terrified. He called me from the precinct. They are charging him with conspiracy, Henry. Conspiracy to commit bank fraud. Because he signed those papers. Because he let Richard use his name." I gripped the phone tighter. This was the knife twisting in the wound. "He is not a boy, Patricia," I said, my voice hardening. "He is 32 years old. He is a man who stood in a title office and signed his name because he wanted a shortcut to a mansion. He wanted the reward without the risk. He is going to prison." "Henry," she sobbed, "they are going to destroy him. You have the money. You bought the debt. You could just forgive it. You could wipe the slate clean. Please, Henry, for the sake of the little boy you used to carry on your shoulders, save him." I looked down at my hand. It was calloused from the harvest. It was a hand that had worked. "I have already saved him, Patricia," I said. She stopped crying. There was a moment of confused silence. "What do you mean?" she asked. "I did not pay off his debt," I said, measuring every word. "I will never pay off his debt. If I did that, I would be robbing him of his dignity. I would be teaching him that Daddy will always fix the world for him. And I will not be around forever, Patricia." "Then what did you do?" she whispered. "I hired a lawyer," I said. "A lawyer," she repeated blankly. "I hired the best criminal defense attorney in New York City," I said. "His retainer is $50,000. I paid it in full this morning. He is a shark, Patricia. He will argue that Brandon was coerced. He will argue that Brandon was a victim of Richard's manipulation, not a partner in his crime. He will keep our son out of prison. I paused, letting the words sink in. But Brandon will still lose the house, I continued. He will still lose his credit rating. He will still have to declare bankruptcy. He will have to get a job waiting tables or working construction to pay his rent. He will have to start at the bottom just like I did. Just like you did before we met. Patricia was silent. I could hear her processing this. I could hear the realization dawning on her that there was no magic check coming. There was no rescue boat. There was only a life raft and a pair of oars. "That is cruel, Henry," she whispered. "To give him a lawyer, but not a life." "No, Patricia," I said. "That is the most generous thing a father can do. I am giving him his freedom. But I am making him pay for his own dinner. That is the lesson. You own your signature. You own your choices." I heard a knock on her motel door. I heard her gasp. "I have to go, Henry," she said, her voice panicked. "It is the bondsman again." "Good luck, Patricia," I said. "Henry, wait," she cried. "When will I speak to you again?" "You won't," I said. I pulled the phone away from my ear. I did not press the end call button. I simply looked at the device. It was a black rectangle of plastic and glass, a portal to a world I no longer inhabited. It was the last link to the man I used to be. I walked over to the large stone fireplace that dominated the living room of the farmhouse. The fire was roaring, consuming the oak logs we had cut last winter. The heat was intense. I tossed the phone into the center of the flames. It landed on a burning log. For a second, the screen lit up one last time, bright and defiant. Then the plastic began to bubble. The glass cracked. The black smoke curled up the chimney, carrying the voices of Patricia and Brandon and Richard away into the night sky. I stood there watching until the phone was nothing but a twisted lump of melted slag. The audit was finished. The books were closed. I turned around and walked out of the heavy wooden door onto the terrace. The night air was cool and crisp, smelling of earth and fermentation. Sitting at the long wooden table under the pergola was Giovanni, my business partner. He was a man of few words and deep loyalty. He had a bottle of our new vintage open on the table. He poured 2 glasses as I approached. The wine was dark, almost black in the moonlight. "Is it done?" Giovanni asked in Italian. I took the seat opposite him. I picked up the glass. I looked at the liquid swirling against the crystal. "It is done," I said. Giovanni nodded. He did not ask for details. He raised his glass. "To the harvest," he said. I touched my glass to his. The sound was a clear, pure note that rang out over the sleeping vineyard. "To the harvest," I repeated. I took a sip. The wine was complex. It tasted of struggle and of sun, of rain and of patience. It tasted like the truth. I looked out over the valley. Tomorrow we would begin pruning the north slope. It would be hard work. My back would ache. My hands would bleed. But every grape I grew would be mine. Every bottle I sold would be real. I was Henry Caldwell. I was 71 years old. And my life was just beginning. I learned that true love is not about grand gestures or expensive gifts. It is about loyalty when the lights go out. I learned that money is a powerful tool, but it makes a terrible master. It can buy a mansion, but it cannot buy a home. It can buy companions, but it cannot buy friends. And most importantly, I learned that sometimes the greatest act of love a parent can offer is to let their child fall so they can finally learn how to stand on their own 2 feet. If you believe that integrity is worth more than any bank account, hit the like button and subscribe to share this lesson with someone who needs to hear it.